Welcome to the start of a new series on here where we're going to talk everything schema therapy. And upcoming months we will mostly dive deeper into the basic framework of schemas. Schema therapy is much broader in techniques and we also have modes, but the upcoming months we're going to mostly talk about schemas. And I'm going to use mostly this book also for the video today, which is really the basics of what is a schema and how does it develop. But in this whole series, if I use any other books or articles, I will link it in the right corner below because I find it important that you actually know where the information is coming from and that you can actually read or research it yourself. So this is the most standard book, I would say. It is written by Jung, who is the founding father, and this is actually the updated version, and I think it's a great beginner's introduction to schema therapy. And today we're going to talk much more about what is actually a schema. And let's just dive into the definition of Jung himself. So you can see it on here. And I think a misconception about schemas is that people sometimes think that it is equal to a core belief, that it is just another term from a different modality for the same thing. And that's not correct. So let's look at what Jung has to say about what a schema is. And this is still also the definition that schema therapists use nowadays. So the first is that it is a broad, pervasive theme or pattern. So it is something that is very present in the life of the person that is struggling with it. And I think that an interesting part of a schema is that, just as you see here, it's not only cognitions, but the whole thing, what we call a schema, also includes bodily sensations, the emotions, and the memories. And I think that's a very interesting part of a schema, is that it is actually very linked to the childhood or the adolescence of people, and also include all the memories where it was kind of reinforced. So if you look at a schema, it is much more than just a core belief. And here you can also see that they say it is dysfunctional to a certain degree. It is, I think, important to mention that we all have dysfunctional schemas. And what is the most difference between maybe people who come to therapy with schemas and the people who don't is like how, I would say, broad they are and how strong they are. And the strength of a schema you can really see in how easily it is triggered. So we might all have sometimes a schema of shame and deficiency. But with you, it might be only triggered once every couple months. And for someone else, it is triggered 10 times a day. So the idea that schemas are only linked to mental suffering is not true. But what you see in practice, and that is what we call here, is also that it has to be dysfunctional to a certain degree to really talk about when is it an early maladaptive scheme. And from what I found very interesting when I started diving into this is the difference between a belief, a core belief, which we mostly use within cognitive behavioral therapy, but also in EMDR or other strategies, is that it really focuses on the whole network. So when we talk about a schema activation, it is indeed the ideas or the core beliefs, but also the bodily sensations, the emotions, and the whole network of memories. So for example, when someone's abandonment schema gets activated, it is not only this belief, I'm gonna get abandoned, but it is also the accompanied bodily sensations, which can be freeze, but more often it is this state of panic, a lot of anxiety running through the body, a sense of hopelessness. So the emotions are also tied, and the whole network linked to abandonment is activated as well. So all the memories where someone might have been really abandoned or there was a threat of abandonment is also active. So you can see that it is a much broader concept that is activated. And I think this is also interesting to understand, is that schema therapy actually developed from cognitive behavioral therapy, and it adapted all kind of different other modalities as a way of treating more personality-based disorders. Because Jung found out that sometimes the focus on the present moment and core beliefs wasn't sufficient enough. And I think compared to the core beliefs of cognitive behavioral therapy, schema therapy really makes that strong link to the past and the understanding of how the schema was formed, and it is actually in the schema. So it has a very direct link to someone's history and someone's upbringing. And as we might know, that is often also what is happening within personality disorders, right? This idea that people have gone through certain things in childhood, they develop certain coping strategies to deal with what they've gone through, and those characteristics, those coping behaviors often form the base of these personality disorders, at least to the DSM-5, where they really tie it to behaviors. Another thing is that another way of describing it is this one. They say it is a self-defeating, emotional, and cognitive pattern that begin early in our development and are repeated throughout life. So again, it is this focus on, it is both cognitive and emotional, and I would also say the memory part of it is very much part of it as well. What is interesting is that you might notice that behavior is not a part of the schema. For myself, I often remember, or when I started this, it's like, it is the whole shabam, it is everything except behavior. So we have bodily sensations, emotions, cognitions, memories, and behaviors is separate within schematherapy. The idea is that when a schema gets activated, how will we respond with behaviors to these schemas? These are called modes. And it is like, I would say, equally important. Maybe in the last decades, the emphasis has sometimes been even more on modes, but I think it's interesting to dive into that as well. But today we're gonna talk more about the schemas. But just know that behavior is not part of the schema. That is what we call modes. And that's also why nowadays you often see also the title Schema Mode Therapy, to emphasize the importance of these modes, the coping modes as well. So that is actually a basic explanation of what a schema is, but there is much more important information or interesting information, so let's dive into that as well. The first one is that we actually, as humans, are kind of drawn to repeating the schema, even when it is a hurtful schema or a dysfunctional schema. And that is really understandable in this human need for consistency. So the brain often wants to be in a predictable environment, even when that predictability is unsafety. If the nervous system and the brain has got a kind of used to being treated in a certain way, we are most likely, sometimes completely in an unconscious way, drawn towards things that will actually make these schemas activated and therefore also strengthening them. So you might also see with clients that sometimes they had these horrible things in childhood, and for some reason, they got into a relationship or a job where these things are repeated. So that is often why it is interesting to take the whole timeline of someone into your mind as well when we're discussing schemas with your client. Another thing is that, as I mentioned already, they can differ in severity and pervasiveness. I find that a difficult English word, pervasiveness, which means that kind of how flexible or rigid they are differs amongst people. And also the severity, what I mentioned before, that even though two people can have an abandonment schema, it can be very different in how often and how severely they are activated. And another important thing of schemas is that even though it is called schematherapy, it could also have been named needs therapy, because schema is actually kind of the second thing that is part of schematherapy. Before the schemas, you have the basic emotional needs. And the idea is that in the very base in schematherapy, you look at emotional needs that children have. These are needs that Jung he came up with it, but it is not that he just thought of this himself. He actually also got it from more childhood research. Currently, they are actually looking up a much more evidence-based framework for it in this article. But in the base, it is this idea that we have 5 basic human emotional needs. And when these needs are not sufficiently met frequently or very intensely, that they haven't been met in a certain amount of time, is that these dysfunctional schemas can develop. So we have all these schemas in therapy, and they are directly linked to a certain basic emotional need that hasn't been met sufficiently. So if you want to take a look at schemas, if you know something about how the needs were met or unmet, you can kind of already form a hypothesis about which schemas will most likely be present in your clients. I'm going to pause it here for a moment so that you can actually read the emotional needs. These are also in a table at my website in English and Dutch, and there is a video I made last year about it as well, because I think even though it is tied to schema therapy, this is easily a part of schema therapy that can be easily kind of copy pasted into other therapies. So let's take a look at the connection between these basic emotional needs and the schemas. So the first basic emotional needs is the need for safety and connection. When that isn't sufficiently met, there are 5 possibly schemas that can develop as a consequence. Here you can actually see them. So we have the emotional deprivation, which is most likely tied to neglect. We have abandonment schema, which is often very tied to having threats of abandonment, real abandonment, or a very unpredictable environment. Then we have mistrust abuse schema, which, as in the name it already says, is often linked to having experienced emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, or growing up in an environment where certain promises were repeatedly not kept. Then we have the defectiveness and shame scheme, which is really this idea that you inherently have less worth than another person. And we have the social isolation scheme, which is most likely tied to this idea of the basic need for connection with others. And if that hasn't been sufficiently met, this idea that you are different than others and will never be part of a group can be formed. And I think it's interesting because it kind of makes sense that these kind of schemas are linked to the need for safety and nurturance. Then we have the basic need for autonomy, competence, and a sense of self. And also with this, it conceptually is kind of logic that if that need hasn't been sufficiently met, we can form an dependency schema or a failure schema, this idea that you're a failure and that you won't be able to complete things in life. We also have the enmeshment schema, which is much more like this kind of very strong emotional, almost incest-like in an emotional way of upbringing, where people really become enmeshed with the parents, which is again a lack of autonomy and a sense of self. And the last one is this vulnerability to harm and illness. And that is also a bit tied to growing up in an unsafe environment, but also with very overprotective parenting, because that really limits the development of a sense of self, autonomy, and this idea, hey, I can do this. Then we have the realistic boundaries need. If that need hasn't been sufficiently met, you can develop an entitlement schema or the self-control deficit schema, which means that you have a problem with kind of delayed gratification, and with entitlement is more the sense that you are more important than other people. And both are often more seen within narcissistic tendencies, or for people with ADHD, it can be really hard to have like proper self-control if it wasn't parented in the right way. Then we have the need of the freedom to express your needs and emotions. So if that hasn't been sufficiently met, these 3 schemas can develop. We have the self-sacrifice, we have the subjugation, and the approval seeking. So all these 3 are kind of really having that focus on other people instead of inwards. And the last one is spontaneity and play. And if that basic need hasn't been met, it is often much more linked to perfectionistic schemas, such as unrelentless norms, punitiveness, emotional inhibition, and negativity or pessimism. So these 18 schemas are linked to the basic emotional needs. At the moment, the schemas, this whole framework is actually kind of revisited by a lot of very smart schema therapists. And at the moment, there is this proposal of adding 2 emotional needs and 2 schemas. So this is the need for justice or more equality with the schema injustice or inequality, and the basic need for self-coherence with the schema of that there hasn't been coherence in the sense of self, others, or the world. If you want to read more about that, I would highly recommend reading this article, but it is interesting to know that at the moment there is this very large worldwide, I would say very thorough research going on into seeing if these are actually constructs that can be added, and also to see more of the evidence base for the already that were there. Interesting thing is at the start of schematherapy, you of course want to know with your clients which schemas are there. And you actually often do this in several ways, but the most forward way is there is a schema questionnaire, the Young Schema Questionnaire, that you can just give to your clients. They can fill it in. It is on a 6-point scale, and at the end, you will receive a score for each schema. And then often we say 4 or higher, we would call it clinical relevant. However, I think it is very important to also practice with this and talk to it in supervision, because sometimes clients aren't really aware of certain schemas, such as the emotional neglect schema. If you don't know yet that you might have been neglected, you might not score that high on it. Also, sometimes people have very strong coping schemas, such as more the self-sacrificing or the relentless norms, so that they don't really have an idea that, for example, there's also a schema of failure or a schema of feeling very ashamed, or that you are deficit. So yes, the questionnaire is important, but your clinical practice and supervision, etc., is just as important. Another way you can get an idea about the schemas is, of course, the intake conversations. Also, letting clients reflect on their emotional needs and how they were met or weren't met. And in the end, you often have, like, I would say you pick often the top ones. And the top ones can be the highest scores or the ones that are most linked to the questions, to the client's problems or ask for help. And here you can see an example of items for the unrelenting norms, which such as I must be the best at most of what I do. I can't accept second best. I feel that there is constant pressure from me to achieve and get things done. And I think it is actually quite a good list in a way that it measures all constructs with several items. It is researched, I wouldn't say endlessly, but it has very a large kind of clinical population that this has been tested on. And it's also interesting to fill out yourself, to learn a bit more like, hey, what are my schemas? Because that is important to know also when you start doing schematherapy, because it's helpful to know what schemas do I have and when do they get triggered by clients. Okay, so that is mostly a broad introduction into schemas. So I think the most important things to remember are that schemas are kind of broad patterns, which is not only a core belief, but also the bodily sensations, the emotions, and the whole memory network. So the timeline from upbringing until now is actually part of the schema. And that schemas are linked to basic emotional needs. Interestingly, in schematherapy until now, it was mostly focused on dysfunctional schemas. However, I would say the last 5 years, it might also have to do with the third wave of more positive psychology, that there is more research into positive schemas. And what we know from this kind of research until now is that positive schemas do exist. And that interestingly, it seems to be kind of separate constructs. So it is not necessarily like a continuum when on one end you have the positive schema and on the other hand you have the dysfunctional schema. There seem to be kind of separate constructs. However, there are high correlations between kind of, I would say, the opposite conceptual schema. Here you can see something more about it. If you want to learn more about it, I would highly recommend just searching for the research. And I think this will be an era of schematherapy that we're going to see much more over the next decade, and how it might actually get integrated into the framework of conceptualization of schematherapy as well. If you have questions about schema or you want to learn more about it, this book is a recommendation, but also this one. It is a bit of an older book. It is Reinventing Your Life. I have, I think, the Dutch version, So it only includes the first 12, but it has a very great explanation about different schemas, and it is written towards clients. So it also helps to kind of find language, how you can talk to these things about, how you can talk about these things to your clients. I hope it was helpful, and I wish you a great day. Bye! Thank you for watching the video. On my website, you can find free Schematherapy related forms that you can use with your clients. We have the form for basic emotional needs, which is kind of an explanation forms, but also has a fill-in assignment, and they are all free to download in Word and PDF. Then we have the case conceptualization, and there is a second page for treatment goals, and there's also an example that can be easily used for you and your clients. Then there is a form that is really focused on the schemas, and it has on the first page an explanation of different schemas, and there are kind of different rows where clients can fill in their questionnaire scores, and then there is like a whole section where they can fill in their most dominant schemas with all the different parts that are like linked to schemas and the modes. And there's also a separate one for the modes with, again, an explanation of modes where they can fill in the scores on the SMI and can kind of dive into how it looks for them. And lastly, there is a schema diary that can be used throughout the treatment.